Hi everybody, welcome to the studio. My name's Tom. This is another episode of Quick Watercolour Birds. This is a request I've had from you guys out there to paint a Bateleur Eagle, and I'm also going to use it as a fantastic opportunity to talk about one of the most famous things about working with watercolour, which is working wet in wet. This is going to be a perfect example to dive a little bit deeper into this wonderful aspect of watercolour. There's a few little tricks and tips that will help you along the way, and I'm going to look at all of those in the context of a painting, and it's going to be a great opportunity to look at working very soft wet into wet in some areas and then kind of working a little bit tighter and a little bit sharper in other areas, particularly the focal point around the face and the eye. If you like these videos, please do consider subscribing. I've got tons more to come. If you have a bird you would like to see me paint, please do feel free to comment. I've got a big long list to work through, but I do plan to get to as many as I can, as many as possible. And I also have loads of other videos on different aspects of watercolour. If you allow me for a moment to mention that I also run Zoom demos, Zoom courses and in-person teaching, along with a Patreon page, which you can find the links to in the description, and hopefully released early 2022 an online watercolour school. That's enough of all that stuff. Let's have a quick look at the materials and the drawing, and then we'll dive into the painting. So I have had a few people ask if I can show the drawing process for these particular videos. Very happy to do so. I think it's a really great idea. I think drawing can be such an interesting part of watercolour, and even if we paint without drawing, we still need to learn and know a lot of the same principles, so I will do that in future videos. However, these are a little backlog of videos that I recorded before that, so I haven't recorded the drawing stage, but I will do it in the future. As with most of my drawings, I'm starting with the big overall shape first, so I really want to focus on placing this bird. I liked placing it over to the left with plenty of negative space. I think it gives it a little bit more tension, a little bit more interest as a composition. So once I've got that big shape in place, really considering the overall proportion, so how wide is the head relative to how high the whole bird is on the page. That's the big shape first. Beyond that, I start to place the face as one big shape, leading into the beak as another big shape. So really focusing again on the proportion of those smaller shapes, firstly in relation to the bigger shape that they sit within, but also in relation to their own selves. So again, how wide is the shape of the face relative to how tall it is, and the same with the beak. Once I have all of that in place, and only then I begin to break up the bird into even smaller shapes. So we start to place the eye, we start to look for the nostril, we start to add bits and chop bits off the very crude basic shapes, and essentially refine the drawing. I keep this drawing fairly simple because a lot of this I can find in the painting process. You'll see that I've got a very rough hint of where the feathers kind of go. It's more to give a rhythm and a feeling of movement to the feathers rather than kind of drawing every single feather exactly as it is. Not a huge amount to talk about in the drawing here. Let's have a look at the materials. So I'm working on a Bao Hong 100% cotton watercolour paper. It's their professional range. It's a gummed block and it's the rough texture. Really beautiful paper. Colours come out nice and clean. Very forgiving paper. Become one of my favourites in recent times. The colours I'm using are very simple. I'm using a Prussian blue, a little bit of ultramarine blue, so there's a cool and a warm blue there that we're going to be using just to give us a nice kind of balance of purples, and also the Prussian in particular helps us get some really deep rich darks, which I'm going to be using a lot of here, particularly when combined with my red, which is a quinacridone red. This is the cooler, pinkier red. It's got a beautiful clean transparency to it. Really wonderful colour. However, I do want a little bit more punch of opaqueness, and this is where I use a Pyro red. It's going to be particularly useful in some of the medium shadow tones on the face. It's just because it's opaque, it's going to have a little bit more strength of colour. I also have a permanent yellow orange out, which I really like as a colour. You can obviously mix a colour very similar, but I find it really useful to have this. And I also have New Gamboge yellow, but you could use any bright clean yellow in this case. The brushes I'm using are a Jackson's Raven size 0 mop. This is faux squirrel hair, lovely and soft, very lively, holds a lot of water and pigment for its size, but also comes to a nice fine point. When I want a little bit more control and I want to home in on some smaller areas with a little bit of detail, I just simply use a size 8 round Winsor & Newton faux sable hair brush. Really beautiful little brush that I've started using recently. Again, it's got a lovely liveliness to it, but it's also very controllable. The rest is just a simple palette, pot of water, the kitchen roll, and that's it. Let's dive into the painting. So I'm starting off with a nice clean, clear wash of pure quinacridone red. You can see that it's fairly watery, but it's got a good strength of pigment to it. I'd say this is about kind of full fat milk consistency. I don't want to go too dark too quickly. And quite often I start a painting with like big, broad, bold brush strokes, but in this particular one, because I want the face to have a little bit more kind of refinement, a little bit more control to it, and it's the face that I'm going to come back to right at the end to bring to life, I'm actually starting here and taking my time, really focusing on getting a nice simple shape, getting the colours flowing together, leaving a few whites of the page just to provide a bit more interest and kind of break the piece up a little bit more. It's always nice to have a few speckles of the white of the page. And then I'm kind of just working out where can I also leave some whites of the page to provide a little bit of detail, or to provide a feeling of light, maybe catching little bits, like a little bit just around the eye, or a little bit on the, like the turn of the nostril and things like that. Here I'm using slightly cleaner or clean but slightly more watery mixture, and what I'm basically doing is just kind of pulling out some of the pigment and lightening that area. I'm now taking some of the much more opaque, I think it's actually permanent red. I mentioned pyro red at the start, but I think it's permanent red, but they do much the same thing. They're both semi-opaque colours. They're both a lovely warm orangey red, and they've got a bit more heaviness and opacity to them, so they're going to give a strength of colour that you won't necessarily get out of the transparent colours. And so just dropping in a strong consistency, like a single cream paint consistency, into a slightly kind of moist wash is going to let that colour kind of bleed out and give us some beautiful gradients and these kind of little hot spots of colour. I'm now taking my New Gamboge yellow at about full fat milk consistency, and I'm just running this ever so gently with the smaller brush into the beak. I'm letting it just kind of touch the edge of the red face in order to get some of the colours to run together. We'll get a kind of incidental orange colour as a result. This is perfect, just letting those colours run together. So I am working wet into wet here, but in quite a controlled way, and I would describe it more as working kind of damp into damp. The water on the page, or the wash on the page, doesn't have a huge amount of water. It's already at a kind of a full fat milk consistency, and the paint that I'm working with is kind of full fat milk or even single cream paint consistency. So this means that I am working wet into wet, but because there's not loads of water and quite a good strong amount of pigment, the colours aren't completely shooting together. It's quite a controlled kind of wet into wet, and this is why I would call it more kind of damp into damp. We're getting soft edges, we're getting lovely little transitions of colour and the colour kind of flowing together, but on quite a small scale and in quite a controlled way. I'm also being careful that I want to leave some whites of the page on the top of the beak here, and you'll notice that I'm quite often going to the palette and just changing the colour ever so slightly. So you'll see that I used a bit more of ultramarine kind of grey purple colour, and just while some of the other colours are wet on the tip of the beak, it's got a kind of redness to it, I just kind of wash a very, very small amount of that bluey colour in there. So this really is quite controlled painting by my standards, and it's, as I said at the start, I want this contrast of the really, really kind of loose and flowing wet into wet work that I'll put into the rest of the body. I want that to contrast nicely with this really refined feeling to the face. I wouldn't necessarily always paint the faces in this refined a way, but it was just kind of what I was going for in this particular painting. And what I'm basically doing here is continuing to work wet into wet, but the initial wash has actually dried off a little bit. It's kind of what we might call at a damp stage. There's kind of a slight sheen to the wash, and I'm working in, again, a kind of single cream paint consistency. And what this is doing, we're still getting that kind of slightly wet into wet softness to the brush strokes, but because the paint is a bit more dry, and because I'm using a slightly thicker consistency of paint, less water and more pigment, the colours aren't flowing together as much. I would describe it as they're kind of staying where they're put a little bit more, but we don't get too many hard edges. If you want a deeper explanation of paint consistency, which is obviously something I'm talking about a lot here, you can hop back and check out this little video that's showing in the corner now. I go really deep into what's called the watercolour clock. And this is a fantastic idea created by a wonderful artist called Joseph Zbukvich. And he basically uses the watercolour clock to help describe that, that kind of combination of how wet is the wash on the page mixed with the kind of paint consistency in your brush, and the way that these two kind of properties interact with each other. So I'm now using an even stronger mix. We might even call this kind of double cream. There's barely any water in the brush. There's kind of a bit of residual dampness in the brush, which makes it kind of flow and is a bit more controllable. And as we go more strong with the paint consistency, less water, we're also at the same time deepening the tone. And by putting a little bit of blue with my quinacridone red, I've created this kind of lovely, deep, rich, kind of dark brown, which is acting as a dark red in this context. And what I'm doing is dropping in little dark accents here and there, just sharpening little things up. And what I'm doing here is really trying to refine the shape of the face so that I feel happy to leave it where it is before I kind of dive into a bigger brush and become more expressive with the shapes around the face, and then eventually into the rest of the body. So I'm now doing what I would call the dark feathers around the face, and I've mixed a really strong paint consistency here of Prussian blue with quinacridone red. Prussian blue being very dark anyway and being quite a greeny blue, when I drop in a little bit of red, which is very opposing to green, they kind of cancel each other out and they create this beautiful, deep, rich dark. And because I'm using Prussian blue transparent and quinacridone red also transparent, this colour has a lovely kind of rich transparency to it. Even though it's dark, it's a beautiful kind of velvety colour. Now I go to my slightly bigger mop brush. I mix a bit of all the colours together to get this kind of neutral, slightly warm, greyish purple. While it's still a little bit of dampness on the face itself, I come in with this kind of single cream paint consistency, and I start to now use bigger, bolder brush strokes and map out the rest of the face. So this is where the expressiveness of these little kind of mop brushes really comes into its own. I know that the colour in the feathers overall has a slightly more purpley warm feeling to it on the left side, then that really lovely orange patch on the lower left side just above the shoulder, and then notice how the feathers take on more of a blue, kind of cool purpley blue sheen as they move over to the right side. So what I'm doing here is almost imagining that the darks are not there and I'm painting like the underlying gradient. And this is the perfect time to work much more wet into wet. I think you would describe this a little bit more as kind of very wet into wet work. You could do it even more than this, but for this painting, this is kind of wet into wet. We're starting with a nice kind of full fat milk sort of paint consistency, maybe slightly more single cream. And every time I go to the palette, I'm actually varying the colour ever so slightly. And as the pigment kind of settles down into the painting, all of these colours will flow together really beautifully and provide this lovely kind of underlying gradient of colour that we can then feed the darks into. I chuck in a load more Prussian blue into the mix and actually a little bit more water here. And this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get this more kind of light blue gradient that sits as a sheen over the feathers in this lower right area. So all of my colour mixing is a bit more in the bias of that direction. So one of the keys here is understanding that as long as a wash has a lot of water in it, it's still very, very workable. As soon as it dries, it kind of dies a little bit. That's, I think, is a saying in watercolour: once it dries, it dies. But while it's still got this beautiful dampness to it, It's very, very forgiving, and it's very, very workable. Notice how I'm bringing in now the strong, strong orange with a little bit more red, and I'm just connecting that into this other wash, which has still got a bit of dampness to it. A lot of this is understanding paint consistency and how it affects what you're doing. If I had loads of water in the brush now and I started kind of throwing it around, because the pigment on the page has already dried off a little bit and wasn't super watery to start with, if I've just got pure water in the brush or far too much water and I start throwing this around now, that's going to flood into these slightly drier areas, and that's when we get these big ugly kind of cauliflowers. Not all cauliflowers are bad, sometimes they can be really good, these kind of watermarks, but it's what happens is water shoots into a drying or drier wash and pushes the pigment out and away as it's settling. We want to be really careful of this, because once the pigment has begun to settle, we don't really want to disturb it too much. We can drop increasingly darker colours in, which is what I'm doing now. I'm mixing like a single cream paint consistency and dropping this into the wet wash. Because the paint consistency is much stronger, it will bleed and still flow, but it won't flow as much as this initial wash that I've done. Again, it will kind of stay put a little bit more, but still have a lovely softness to it. However, if that had loads of water in it, it would shoot into and cause watermarks into the surrounding area. So again, it's really understanding what level of wetness your page is at. Is it very, very wet and watery? Has it dried off a little bit, which we're calling kind of moist? Or has it gone really, really dry, which we're calling, but still got a sheen to it, which we're calling damp? Beyond that, we have to then think about the paint consistency in our brush. Is there a lot of water and very little pigment, which we're calling kind of tea, milky coffee consistency? Is it got a little bit more pigment and a bit more substance, which we're then calling full fat milk? And then beyond that, we're getting into like single cream, double cream, and then eventually kind of neat paint, which is often called things like Marmite, Vegemite, butter, peanut butter, anything like that to describe the paint consistency in the brush. So I am now still working very much wet into wet, you could call it, but it's more kind of this really strong paint consistency into a drying wash. And by doing this, I'm going to be able to get this kind of feeling of feathers. So I'm squinting and blurring my eyes and looking for patterns of really deep, rich dark. And I'm not working the paint into the wet wash. I'm kind of placing it in and pushing it in and brushing it in is the best way I can think to describe it. If I start working the paint, I'm going to muddy the pigment. The paint's going to take on that kind of dead, horrible look to it. If I can work in this more kind of wet into wet way, not overworking the paint, the colours will flow together more, and we get this wonderful kind of deep, rich transparency even in the dark colours. So again, if I'd gone in any earlier into that area under the face, and or I'd used less pigment and more water, those colours would have flowed together a lot more and we wouldn't have had any definition. So it's all about timing depending on what effect you want to get. I knew I wanted to get the effect of feathers, but I didn't want it to be really rigid and stiff. I wanted it to have that softer wet into wet feel to contrast with the more refined features of the face. So I waited till it had dried off a little bit, where it really just had a bit of watery sheen to it, and I used a stronger consistency of paint, and that combination of more pigment in the brush, less water, and a slightly dry wash gives a certain level of definition, but also a certain level of softness. We're kind of at this lovely in-between stage. I'm now taking this idea round the top of the bird. I'm always looking to simplify. This area that I'm working in now has pretty much dried off, so we're now working kind of wet over dry. So this is a slightly different approach. So what I have to do here is, if I want sharper marks, I can get it because the wash that I'm painting on top of has dried, so it's easier to get sharper, more defined marks. However, if I want those softer, kind of more gentle marks, then I have to lay down the sharper mark first, then come in with a clean damp brush and just kind of hit the edge of them to soften those edges down. So we're not really working wet into wet, we're working wet over dry and then softening edges as I need to. However, now this back side of the head that I'm working into, this does have a little touch of dampness to it still. So this is a perfect time to start brushing in the stronger consistency of paint. We're back up to maybe double cream paint consistency into kind of like a damp or moist wash. It's hard to tell exactly where it's at. There's a bit of water kind of visible on the surface there, so it's the perfect time to go in with this thicker paint consistency. And you can see by going in thicker, we're pushing in kind of the deeper shadows now. And we're starting to slowly increase the definition, but not really kind of sharp defined marks. We're in this lovely middle stage still where the marks are kind of soft and flowing, but we are beginning to push things darker and beginning to have a little bit more definition. And this is the real, for me, is the real joy of watercolour, is slowly watching it come to life and develop, and kind of trusting the process, knowing that watercolour becomes more and more finished. Not only the darker we go, but also the sharper we go in places. We don't need to sharpen up everywhere, not by a long shot. What you'll see here is that actually really only the outside edge of the bird and then the features within the bird are sharp. A lot of the rest of it remains fairly soft and fuzzy, but that's enough information to make the painting look finished, or at least finished to the standard of what I want. Some people like to leave it even looser and more flowing. Other people like to tighten it up a little bit more, but all of that is personal preference. Okay, so I'm mixing a slightly warmer dark here. This is the same kind of dark mixture of the blues, particularly the Prussian, mixed with the quinacridone red, but shifting the bias towards the quinacridone red obviously gives it more of that kind of warm browny purpley feel. Shifting it back towards blue kind of pushes it to be cooler and kind of more bluey purple. So the area I'm working on now, some bits have kind of dried off. The bit I'm working into specifically at the moment has still got a dampness to it, so that's slightly different. So I'm kind of getting a feel for things as I go. Some marks are going to be sharper and more defined because they're wet over dry. Other areas are going to be a little bit more kind of damp into damp and therefore have a bit more softness to them. So you can see I'm kind of pausing at certain brush strokes, and it's because I'm trying to work out like what level of dampness is an area at. It's not super critical because we're away from the focal point. It really doesn't matter too much, but I'm just trying to be wary. I'm just trying to understand what the paint's going to do. I'm kind of pausing and thinking, right, how much have I got on the brush? In this case, very, very strong pigment, almost neat paint. We call this somewhere between double cream and kind of Marmite consistency. And therefore, even with the dampness on the page, it's still giving us a very defined mark. The only difference is I have to be wary that we're pushing the tone darker now. So if I do this too much, it's going to completely destroy the light areas. So it really is a balance here between finding the balance between pushing colours darker but not completely destroying the lovely fresh colours that we've got underneath, because the darker we go, the more it destroys the light. I've actually come to a slightly bigger brush here. I didn't mention this at the start, and this is a slightly bigger version of the Jackson's Raven mop. You don't specifically need it, but I just wanted some bigger brush strokes in that bottom left corner, and it simply just covers more paper quicker. That's it. Don't necessarily need it. You could use any bigger brush. I'm using lovely strong rich paint here, definitely kind of double cream consistency. Loads of the pyrrole red in there in that lower right hand corner. That gives us a really deep rich dark, but because the pyrrole red is in there, it creates a slightly different type of dark. You'll see that that opaque red kind of sits in there as nice little interesting little spots of colour, and all it does is create variety and interest. It's just a way of making not everything the same, creating a bit more variety. You'll notice I'm being really free in this bottom left corner. It's well away from the focal point. I know that I want to get the colours kind of back to flowing together, big simple shapes. Notice how the closer we get to the focal point of the face, the more precision is in there. As we get away from the face down towards the bottom left corner and the bottom area of the bird, much bigger brush, working much more wet into wet, therefore getting much less definition, but what we are getting is loads of beautiful colours flowing together. We're getting an influence of the colour underneath. Because I'm using so much water, the wash has got more transparency to it, and therefore the first blue wash that has dried is still giving this lovely glow to the wash on top. Even the blue going over the top of the orange is giving some interesting colours. The Pyrrole red bleeding into the Prussian blue is giving some beautiful colours. The strong, rich quinacridone red brushed in for the orange area of the back is bleeding into the Prussian blue and also giving some wonderful colours. So, bigger brush, more water, much less control, but what we get are these amazing kind of things happening that we can never kind of predict necessarily. There was a little bit of jump in the film there. It was actually only about a 15-second period where I'd not noticed that the camera had run out of battery. All I'd done is add a few final sweeps of deep rich dark in that lower left area to really punch it up, and you'll see there's a slight speckling in a couple of areas behind the face and also in that lower area. Here I've just used very quickly a mister. I just do a gentle mist over an area and it just provides that lovely little feeling of texture and speckledness. And as I said, just during that little jump, all I did there's maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 or so really deep, rich marks which you can see in that lower area. That's the only thing that changed there. So at this point, I'm really happy with how the body of the bird feels. For me, it's got this lovely combination of loads of wet into wet where the colours are really flowing together. We've then got more of the kind of damp into damp work where there's more pigment in the brush, less water, and the wash on the page has dried off a little bit. So we get that kind of little bit more defined look to things. And for me, it's a really lovely combination of all of these different things. And then where I have gone a little bit sharper, it's still nice big brush strokes. And I'm really happy with that. And now I can come back to the initial washes on the face and I can start to really pull the face together, put in the deeper darks, the deep shadows, the little bits of definition. And I feel much more confident with how far to push those ideas because I've got the rest of the bird as good as finished, and I can kind of play the two off each other. I can see how far I need to go with the definition in order to get the feeling that I want because the rest of the bird is as good as finished. And what you'll find painting like this is that the very loose and very wet into wet areas, they really play off against the more refined, controlled areas, and the controlled areas make the wet into wet feel even looser and more expressive, and then the more expressive loose areas kind of make the refined areas feel even more refined, so they kind of support each other in that sense. So I'm down with the smaller brush. I'm using a fairly strong consistency of paint here, and what I'm basically looking for is where can I define some edges. I don't want to go in and perfectly draw lines around everything. I don't even want to go in and define every single edge, but what are some of the important edges and the important deeper darks and deeper shadows that are going to make the face pop. That's what I'm looking for here. And what you'll see is actually I don't spend a lot of time actually painting. There's a lot of me kind of taking a moment to look at the painting. There's a lot of me taking a moment before doing the brush stroke, and there's quite a lot of time spent on the palette just getting the right sort of paint consistency and the right colour. So I'm not going in there and labouring and working the paint. I'm almost kind of picking very specific brush strokes, and they are still just brush strokes. We're not working the paint. They're kind of little hits of the brush, little shots of the brush. If you lay down something and you decide it's a little bit too sharp, you can always come in and kind kind of soften it down with a damp brush. And the way that I like to work here is that I kind of imagine that I've already got the lights down. They've dried already. I'm now painting initially the what I would call like the medium or the gentle shadow. So it's notably darker than the lights that I've already got on, but it's not a really deep dark. So I start there, usually about single cream paint consistency. As that's drying, I then look to, if necessary and where it's needed, drop in the final level of kind of deep dark. And this is a process that I use a lot. Paint in the lights first, leave lots of highlights. Beyond that, start to look for the gentle or medium shadow, and then as the gentle or medium shadow dries, I slowly start to drop in the deeper darks, which push the watercolour to a finish. They start to give more form and shape, and they also start to give a bit more definition in certain areas, which just kind of makes more sense of some of the more abstract areas, and that's basically what I'm doing at this stage. And you'll see what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to get a little bit more form and definition around the nostril area to kind of shape it a little bit more, and I'm going really gently. It'd be so easy to completely ruin the painting at this stage, and because it is the focal area, we even more so need to keep those washes simple and not overworked. So I'm kind of laying in a colour, seeing how it looks, coming in with a clean damp brush and just kind of hitting the edge and softening it down, and it almost gives the illusion that you've painted an area wet into wet, when in actual fact you've laid down a wash, let it dry, and then you've softened a new wash over the top, and it has that kind of wet into wet feeling. It will never have quite the same feeling as working wet into wet, because then you get all these colours flowing together and the paint does things you can never imagine. But it's a great way of just laying in a shadow. Is it too hard edged? If so, soften it down. And we're really on the last little push here. There's not much more to do with this at all. I'm just making little refinements, putting in little extra shadows here and there, and we're not far off kind of washing in the eye. And as soon as that eye goes in, everything makes sense and comes to life. So I'm pushing the pigment onto the brush. It's about a double cream paint consistency, and you'll notice me kind of using the brush on the palette one side onto the other. And what that does is it kind of squashes the edge of the brush down into a very fine flat point, which makes it really controllable. And what I'm doing here is painting the dark of the eye, leaving two white abstract shapes to present the highlights, which in itself looks good. I've really taken time there to focus on the accuracy of the overall shape. It's not just a round shape, it's a round in places, but it's also got sharp edges in other places, and it's not just a round shape, it's a bit more abstract and specific than that. I then go in with a clean brush, and you'll see me use that little trick of just pulling out some pigment in the lower half. What this does is create a lovely kind of gentle soft blue, which looks like that kind of gentle sheen that you get on the eyeball. So we have this very sharp, hard highlights, and then this lovely kind of soft reflected sheen, and the two play off each other really well and give us this lovely kind of realistic look. You'll notice that I just left a few little bits of the white of the page around the dark eye within the red area. That gives this lovely kind of sparkle to the area and makes it pop a little bit more. So some people actually like to start with the eye, because they say if I don't get the eye right, then there's no point in doing the rest of the painting, which I completely agree with. The eye is the real key to this. But for me, it's like I love painting the eye last. I don't always paint the eye last. It's whatever works for you. But I often paint the eye last because it's almost like the reward or the little cherry on top for getting all the rest of it working. And if I know that it's working kind of as it is, then once I put the eye in, it's only going to look better. And the eye, it just, you pop it in and it really does just kind of make it pop and zing and makes it come to life. So right at the end here, I'm using a opaque white. It's actually white gouache. Really careful not to use too much of this. As I've mentioned before in other videos, there is a whole school of watercolourists who are very against using opaque white. I do understand why. You don't want to fall back on it. The whites of the page are always preferable. But having said that, one or two little shots of pure white here and there, if you've missed a highlight or an area just needs a little extra pop or zing, can be really effective. The white I put on there was too big, so I cut back in. I put white mixed with the opaque red, and it just gives that red a little bit more body, makes it more controllable for a little bit more refinement. I think the real key to using opaque whites or any light opaque colours is to understand that less is absolutely more. Only use it if you really feel it's going to make a difference, and only use it in a handful of places at most. I actually ended up using it really as a pure white in just one place there. I then mixed it with a little bit of red to give the red a bit of body, to just make a tiny little adjustment in that other area. You could even argue that I actually didn't need to do either of those things and it was perfectly fine. So yes to opaque white if you feel drawn to do so and you feel it's going to improve the painting, but go really, really easy with it. And that's that one done. So I was really happy with that one. I think it's a great example of also taking a photo and turning the painting into something that is clearly of the photo, but not exactly like the photo. Like I've clearly not rendered all of those feathers to anywhere near the same level that they are in the photo. And you could very happily go in it and spend much, much more time rendering all those feathers, making them look exactly like the photo. What I'm aiming for in this particular one is an impression of the feathers, something that is kind of indicating the feathers. It's kind of like the feathers. It's influenced by the photo, but it's not a copy of the photo, and that's just the way I like to work. There's nothing wrong with working in other ways at all, but as I said, this is a great opportunity to show you that wet into wet, and that wet into wet is perfect for those feathers to contrast with that sharper kind of detail in the face and the eye. Just the reminder that the paint consistency is the key to working wet into wet. We can work loads of different colours with lots of water and lots of pigment in the realm of kind of anywhere from tea up to kind of milky or full fat milk consistency, and those colours will really flow together. Then as those washes are sitting on the page, if you want to drop some darker colour and some stronger colour in, you begin to up the level of pigment, reduce the level of water. What will also happen is you will get darker tones, stronger colours, and those colours, depending on how wet the page is, will merge into different degrees. If the page is still very wet, they may merge in completely and dissolve into there, just giving kind of darker patches. However, as the wash on the page begins to dry, mixed with upping the level of pigment and reducing the amount of water in your brush, you will get increasingly more defined marks as the paint kind of softens less and less into the existing wash, because the existing wash is continuing to dry to a certain stage, and also because you're using less water in the brush, there's less water for the pigment to spread out. That's kind of what's happening there. So think of it almost as a process, like you start wet to get the colours flowing. As that wetness begins to dry, you begin to increase the level of pigment and reduce the level of water in the brush to get more defined marks and get deeper darks, and as time goes on, your marks will get more and more defined and your colours will get darker and darker to a point. And then you saw that I was working in a much more controlled way, which I was calling damp into damp in the face, so working with kind of single cream paint consistency. The paint's still flowing a little bit, but not as much. Once that dry, I came over the top just with a few little accents of dark here and there. There really wasn't a lot going on there, fairly simple. That's it, guys. As I said at the start, please do feel free to subscribe, give me a thumbs up, drop me a comment, and you can find links to all of the places where you can see me and my work on all the other platforms on the internet, etc, etc. Links in the description. Thanks for watching. Happy living, happy painting, and I will catch you in the next video.